Now we're going to move into our second spotlight speaker. And I just want to really, again, emphasize how impactful and powerful equity work can be in residency partnerships. When you have that intention and that will, and you take definitive action, you can make some transformative changes. And so, you mentioned you've heard several things coming up, a lot around support, but a lot around mental health support and well-being, right? And so that is going to be our second equity spotlight issue to address compassion fatigue and well-being. And our speaker today is a second, or I guess it's third speaker now, but our third speaker is Dr. Heather Michel. She's an education consultant, master educator, and the founder of the organization of Teachers of Color Matters. She's worked in education field for over 22 years, and she's currently the residency coordinator for Cal State Teach, where she manages 3 residency programs across the state of California. So before moving to higher ed, she was a curriculum coach at a Spanish language 50-50 dual immersion school, and she taught first and second grade at a charter school for 13 years. She's passionate about teachers of color, social justice, and their retention. With that, let's turn it over to Dr. Heather Michel.
Thank you, Dr. J. Appreciate the introduction and have just enjoyed the presentation so far. So yes, I wear many hats in the teacher education space, but today I'm sharing with you the perspective as a consultant. My company is Teachers of Color Matter. I host retreats for teachers of color specifically in service of their retention and career sustainability. Go ahead and advance the slide. So yes, I got into the residency space through National University. I currently work at Cal State Teach as the residency coordinator for 3 different residency programs here in California, 2 in LA and 1 with Salinas City Elementary School District. So that's kind of my context. I will share some objectives that kind of give us a target during the short time that I'm with you today to achieve clarity around our common objective of TOC retention. So adding an additional layer of understanding around that and kind of doing a deeper dive into what it's like to be a teacher of color in terms of mental health and wellness. Dr. J has touched on this previously, but in terms of characteristics and evidence of an effective California teacher residency program, we're really here for standard 1. Equity and justice are defined in advance at all levels of residency work. So really leaning into that specific standard. So go ahead, Dr. J. So in terms of how I came into this space of teachers of color retention and sustainability, you know, based on my own experiences, but also when I came across this statistic, right? 65% of teachers of color will leave the profession before their 5th year in the residency space. And on this call, I know we are deeply committed to their retention and sustainability. But across the country and in public education, although we are putting efforts into recruiting them, the idea of retaining them is still not something that is still an area of alarm, right? This is kind of a large statistic and continues to be part of our work together. So kind of using that as our backdrop. Go ahead. So today, I'm going to just talk to you briefly about some operating belief systems that I like to contextualize my work with. And, you know, what is the common understanding that's needed to support this work? And so I'm going to unpack the 2 operating belief systems, and then I'm going to do a deeper dive into one specifically and look at some participant feedback for a study I did with one of the first residency programs that I supported. So the first belief system really is this idea that teachers of color are welcome at the table. And I think on this call, we are all on board with that specific belief system. I think sometimes where the rub is like, okay, well, what does that exactly mean? And what does that look like in terms of action items? And one of the ways I'd like to conceptualize this is this idea of hosting a dinner party, right? Most of us have an experience with that. I know for me personally, I love hosting my family. I love showing them that I care about them and love them in this way. But for me specifically, hosting a dinner party with my family can be somewhat of a challenge, right? Because I have 2 cousins that are very strict vegans. I have 2 other cousins that are hardcore carnivores, but don't eat gluten or dairy. I have my husband who's like an aspiring pescatarian. My sister and I are always doing some kind of keto Whole30 thing. My kids just want meat and potatoes, right? And so it's this idea of like wanting to accommodate and host a group of people that I deeply care about. I want them to feel seen and heard. And I want to honor some of these decisions that they've made that are very personal decisions in terms of their dietary needs, right? But in order to do that, and especially for a traditional meal like Thanksgiving or any other celebration that I would have them over for, I'm going to have to do something out of the box. I'm going to have to push back on what we've done in the past. Like I can't just do a turkey, right? I'm going to have to think about other ways to kind of make them feel seen and heard. And that's the lens that I bring to this work, right? So what can we be doing differently? How can we be thinking outside the box? What kind of structures can we push back on that have always been in place that are really just not serving us in terms of this new idea of teachers of color and specifically retention and sustainability? And so what that looks like is how are we communicating our invitation? A lot of our teachers of color experience trauma in their own K-12 experiences. And how are we really honoring that and have an understanding of that when they come into our residency programs? What artifacts communicate are welcome? I think artifacts, people tend to dismiss these, but as a person of color coming into the K-12 space as now a leader and as a teacher, and bringing past trauma of your own K-12 experiences with you, that person of color, that teacher of color is looking for evidence that they belong in this space. So it's little things like, does the receptionist speak two different languages? What does the leadership look like in the residency program and in the district at large? Who's going to be my mentor? How can we communicate to our teachers of color and provide these little data points that communicate to them that they do belong and that they do and that they will be successful in the residency program. And then, of course, lastly, how are we preparing the experience to support the specific needs of our dinner guests, right? And so that goes along with my second belief system, which is, which is teachers of color need differentiated support. And so for these next slides, I'm going to unpack this specific belief system in 3 different ways, and then I'll offer some specific quotes from residency participants in regards to the differentiated support that I'm proposing. So the first element that kind of distinguishes teachers of color as a demographic is that they usually become teachers because of what's been referred to as humanistic commitments. So they aren't just choosing the teacher profession because they like kids or they like to teach kids how to read, right? These are teachers that have a very specific purpose as to why they chose this profession. They want to give back to their community. They want to be the teacher that they never had. They want to address marginalized, support and uplift marginalized communities that they often represent themselves. And so because of that additional humanistic commitment or that additional like strong sense of purpose, they oftentimes put additional pressure on themselves, right? They're not just teaching kids how to read, they're uplifting these students to overcome specific obstacles that their own students face. And that can add an additional pressure onto their own like personal expectations, but then also the expectations that they may feel that the residency program or their school system is putting on them. And so I'll just share this quote to support that sentiment. I feel that as a teacher of color, our experiences were not the best experiences in the classroom. We were dehumanized. We were just test scores. My teachers had to maintain order. I'm trying to undo everything that was done to me. I'm trying to be the educator I never had. That's what brings me back every time. Okay, so that real intentionality around, I'm trying to do something different here. Next slide. Second, we live in a society that upholds white supremacy norms and values. Okay, those values are reflected in our lived institutions, including public education. So we work within a system that is not structured oftentimes for our students of color, but is not especially structured for our teachers of color. And so thinking about ways that we can be intentional about dismantling and kind of pushing back on some of those structures in terms of our teachers of color and microaggressions that they might experience, specific roles that might be put on them because of their identity with a specific racialized group. And I think one of the things that has come up for teachers, especially if I could add, is that when something like that happens for a person of color in education, there isn't really an avenue to address it. There's not really a place for them to actively address it. And so that's an additional concern as well. But to support this sentiment, and this is from a resident that she's talking here of a specific experience she had in her teacher preparation program, but this specific student took 11 years to get her teaching credential. And whenever I reflect on that, I just think, like, if that's something that she wanted, why did it take so long for her? Why did we make it so hard, right? And she says, when I went to my college advisor and shared that I wanted to be a teacher, she informed me that I wasn't teacher material. But I didn't feel like I belonged anywhere else. In the program, I wasn't getting the grades I felt like I deserved. When I compared my papers to my friends, their marks were higher. My professor was marking me down for punitive things on my assignments. Okay. And the third thing here is this idea of compassion fatigue, right? So compassion fatigue, one of the things that came out of COVID is like this heightened awareness around wellness and mental health. But what I'm kind of arguing here is that compassion fatigue looks different for teachers of color. And what I mean by that is that when we share the same experiences of our students, it's a gift, right? When we bring in students that reflect the communities that we're serving, it's a gift because they can create lessons that are in line with culture relevant pedagogy. They can say the exact best thing to their students that will put their students at ease. Perhaps they speak the same language as their students. But the other side of that coin is that if you are shepherding or taking care of students that are also experiencing the same trauma that you experienced as a child, there's a rawness there. And there's an opening and opportunity to be re-traumatized yourself. And that adds an additional emotionality to teachers of color that is not currently being addressed, right? And so that's an additional, it's an additional consideration. So I have a couple of quotes here that speak to that experience. One of my participants says, in my first teaching placement, the veteran teachers would mention how well I fit into their school. Even though it was my first year, I was home. Those students were me. I was them. I grew up in that district and my parents lived a few minutes away. So that deep identification with the students, but also there's an opening for that rawness that can happen when you have shared experiences. The second quote is, teachers of color struggle because they invest differently in their students. We have different expectations and an awareness that we can't ignore. I find it difficult to disconnect from the experiences of my students, right? That idea of like taking those experiences home. It's not something we can dismiss as if we were a teacher that didn't have those shared experiences. So from my perspective, as I look at this tree that Dr. J is presenting here, and I call it a tree, and I see these as branches, I really think about mental health and wellness, and again, it's been touched on in the previous presentations as like the biggest bang for your buck, right? There are these things that are in place, like the unfair expectation around testing and some of these other issues around white supremacy and some of the structures that happen in our school systems. Some of that we don't have control over, but we do have control over mindset. We do have control over how we interact with compassion fatigue in our school settings. And I think that, these are tools that as professionals, our teachers can lean into as they move through their teaching career, right? And so really focusing on that. And the last thing I'll leave you with is just some action items. Like, what does this mean for me as someone that works in higher ed or someone that works at the district level? And I think the first thing, like an easy thing, and it also was evidence in the prior two presentations, is just this idea of asking your residents, like doing those focus groups, spending time with them and saying, how can we best support you? The second point is affinity groups. From my perspective, affinity groups is something, it's almost like the low-hanging fruit. Like sometimes in districts and higher ed, it's hard to move these kind of more structural things out of the way, but putting a focus group or an affinity group together, just like Sarah did early in their presentation, is such a strong way to really normalize the experiences that our teachers of color are having and to draw strength from the cohort and being in space with others that share those experiences. adopt critical race theories. So we have these specific theories like critical race theory and culturally responsive pedagogy, and those are something that we draw on readily in education for students of color, but also applying those same ideas to how we interact with our teachers of color. Spend time on purpose and identity. So what I mean with these last two bullet points is really when you are adopting when you are moving your resident candidates through those first couple of weeks of the residency program, spending time and being intentional with developing their sense of identity, their sense of purpose, and as it relates to their identity as a teacher of color in the profession. And I'll leave it at that, and also say that in the resources link that the resources link that Dr. J has provided, there's an activity that I have linked in there that will move you through some of these action items in a more intentional way. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Dr. J. And yes, please keep in touch. Reach out to me if you want a thought partner regarding these topics. I would love to talk to you more about these issues and reach out.
Thank you so much, Heather. I appreciate you sharing your insights and thoughts. Again, this idea that mental health and well-being really matter, and then thinking about what I shared with you earlier, that depending on how you roll through the world, your the color of your skin, your ability, sexual orientation, all of these things, you have different experiences, and mental health and well-being and how we interact with that and that impact hits a little differently. So we definitely need to be thinking about how we might differentiate the supports that are offered around that. And so I appreciate you taking the time to share that with us.